You didn't find a tank, old man. You found a junk pile and a bedtime story.
You didn't find a tank, old man. You found a junk pile and a bedtime story. The kid behind the counter said it loud enough that the others laughed. Earl Vance just stood there in his mud-caked boots, a folded photograph trembling in his weathered hand. He had driven 40 minutes to ask for help with something buried in his backyard. They decided he was confused. Senile, probably. An old man with dirt under his nails and a wild story about a war machine hidden under his vegetable patch. He did not argue. He nodded once, slid the picture back into his shirt pocket, and walked out to his truck. What none of those young men understood was that they had just laughed at a man who would spend the next 60 days proving every one of them wrong, alone, with his bare hands. If you believe respect is earned and never handed out, type respect down below before you watch one more second of this. Earl Vance was 78 years old, and he moved through the world the way an old engine idles, low and steady, and giving nothing away. He stood a little under 6 feet, but carried himself shorter than that now, with a slight hitch in his step that came from a left knee. An M48 transmission had crushed against a concrete bay floor in the winter of 1971. His hands were the first thing anyone noticed who bothered to look, and almost nobody bothered. They were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, the nails permanently rimmed with the kind of grease that no soap on earth scrubs out after 50 years. He had a habit of reaching into his right trouser pocket and turning something over between his thumb and forefinger when he was thinking, small flat disc he never showed anyone. He hummed under his breath when he worked, tuneless old marching cadences his sons never recognized. Poor. He lived alone on 11 acres of patchy Maryland farmland in a white clapboard house that needed paint. In the same quiet way he had lived ever since his wife Ruth had passed 3 winters back, which is to say carefully, modestly, and without once asking the world for anything it did not freely offer. His days had a shape worn smooth by repetition. He rose before light out of a habit the army had branded into him 60 years ago, and could not be argued out of. He made coffee in a dented percolator, drank it black on the back step, watching the tree line go from grey to green. Then he found something to fix. Because there was always something to fix, and because a man's hands need a reason to get up in the morning, the same as the rest of him does. He kept the old truck running on parts that should have failed a decade back. He kept Ruth's roses alive, though he had no particular gift for it, because they had been hers, and he could not bring himself to let them die twice. The neighbours, when they thought of him at all, thought of him as the quiet old fellow at the end of the lane who waved but did not talk much. That suited him. He had buried 2 friends and a wife, and most of the men he had served with, and he had learned that the world does its grieving on its own schedule, and asks no one's permission. And so he simply kept on, steady and low, old engine that had outlasted the vehicle it was built for. He had been a tanker. Drafted in 1967, he had crewed M48 Patterns in the Central Highlands, come home in one piece by the grace of luck he never believed he deserved, and then spent the next 20 years in army motor pools with his arms buried to the elbow in steel that other men would ride into danger. He knew machines the way some men know Scripture. He could close his eyes and name every bolt in a power pack by feel, but that was not the thing that made the men at the museum wrong about him, and it was not the thing he carried in his pocket. The disc was a penny, worn smooth and brown, and it had not been minted for Earl Vance. It had been carried out of a burning tank in the summer of 1944 by a man who pressed it into Earl's father's hand. And Earl's father had carried it for 50 years afterward, like a stone he could never set down, and on the day he gave it to his son, he had asked him for one promise that Earl had spent his entire life quietly failing to keep. The morning it began was an ordinary one, grey and cool, the kind of late April morning where the dew sits heavy on the grass until the sun finally decides to bother with it. Earl had it in his head to put in a proper vegetable bed behind the house, the way Ruth always wanted, and he was turning over the soil with a long-handled spade when the blade rang against something 3 feet down. Not the dull thud of a rock, clean, bright clang of steel on steel that he felt travel up the handle and into the bones of his wrists, and he stopped, because a man who has spent his life around armour knows that particular sound the way a sailor knows the smell of a storm. He knelt. He scraped the dirt away with the edge of the spade, and then with his bare fingers, and what came up out of the ground was not a buried pipe or an old plough blade. It was a long, gentle curve of cast steel, gun-blued black under the rust, and it ran away from him into the earth in both directions. Further he dug the more. The ground refused to give up the end of it. He uncovered a barrel. Barrel ran back into the rounded swell of a gun mantlet. The mantlet ran back into the unmistakable cast shoulder of a turret. Foot by foot, on his knees in the cold mud, with his heart going like a trip hammer, Earl Vance understood that he was not kneeling beside a relic. He was kneeling on top of an entire tank, buried whole and forgotten beneath his own backyard, 3 counties away. A man who had spent 50 years searching for one specific machine was about to have his quiet retirement turned upside down by a phone call he did not yet know was coming. He dug all day. He dug until the light went orange and then grey and then gone, till his back seized and his hands bled through the work gloves. And by dark he had freed perhaps a third of the hull, and learned exactly how little one old man with a spade can do against a 33-ton machine the earth has been holding for the better part of a century. The smell came up out of the hole as he worked, the cold mineral smell of deep clay, and under it, faint sweet rot of old grease and the bitter ghost of burned metal, a smell he knew from 40 years of motor pools and could not at first place, out here under the open sky. The hull rang differently in different places when he tapped it, solid here, hollow there, the steel telling him where the compartments were the way a doctor reads a chest. The thing was a Sherman. He knew it the moment he cleared the front plate, the broad-sloped glacis and the spaced bolt heads as familiar to him as his own face. An M4 medium tank, the workhorse that had carried America across France and into Germany. It sat low and patient in its grave, hatches dogged shut, road wheels packed solid with clay, and when he laid his palm flat against the cold steel, he felt something he could not have explained to anyone, a kind of recognition, as if the machine knew him too. That night he could not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, with the penny in his fingers and his father's voice in his ears. First light, he climbed into his truck and drove to the one place he was certain would help him, the Ironwood Military Vehicle Museum out on the county road. The place with the restored half-track in the parking lot and the banner that read WE, Bring History Back to Life. The young man at the restoration counter was named Tyler Cates, and he was good at his job and tired of his life in roughly equal measure. He was 26, talented with a wrench, underpaid, and worn down by a steady parade of people who walked through that door certain they had found something extraordinary in a barn or a creek bed, who turned out to have found a rusted tractor or a movie prop or nothing at all. So when an old man in a feed store cap laid down a blurry photograph of what might have been a length of pipe in a muddy hole and said the words, "A whole tank in my backyard," Tyler did what stress and cynicism had trained him to do. He smiled the smile that is not kindness. He called over his buddy Marcus from the paint bay so Marcus could hear it too. And he said the thing about the junk pile and the bedtime story, and the two of them laughed, and the old man put his picture away and left without a word. Tyler felt the small, sour satisfaction of a man who has protected himself from being made a fool, and he went back to sanding a fender and forgot about it inside of an hour. He did not notice the young woman at the front desk, Danny Okafor, part-time archivist, who logged donations and ran the registry database. Watching the old man's truck pull out of the lot, he did not know that in the corner of that blurry photograph, where the old man had wiped one patch of hull plate clean with his thumb, there was a row of stenciled characters, a registration number, and that Danny had seen it, and that something about it would not let her sleep that night either. Earl drove home the long way, past the old chain-link fence lines that nobody could quite explain anymore, the ones that ran through the woods behind the subdivisions and ended at concrete footings green with moss. He had grown up around here. He knew, the way locals half know things, that all of this land had once been the government's, that during the war and after it, there had been an army facility out here, the Hartwell Ordnance Annex, where they tested and stripped and disposed of things the public never saw. That. When it closed in the late 50s, they had bulldozed most of it under and sold off the parcels cheap. His father had bought 11 of those acres in 1961. Earl had never thought to ask why a man would want raw scrubland this far from anything. He had been a boy. And his father, Master Sergeant Thomas Vance, had never been a man who explained himself. Tom Vance had commanded a Sherman across Normandy in the summer of 1944, had come home with a limp and a silence, and had worked the last 15 years of his career as a civilian mechanic at the very annex whose ground his son now gardened. He almost never spoke of the war. He spoke of it exactly once that mattered, near the end, and Earl, sitting alone in his kitchen with the penny warm in his fist, was only now beginning to understand what his father had been trying to tell him. He remembered things now that he had filed away as nothing for 60 years, the way you do when a single new fact reaches back and rearranges the whole shape of the past. He remembered his father driving him out to the annex as a boy on a Saturday, ostensibly to show him the shops, and how the old man had stood for a long time at the fence of the disposal yard, looking at a row of gutted hulks with an expression Earl had no name for then, and had every name for now. He remembered that his father, who could fix anything, had never once owned a hunting rifle, or kept so much as a service pistol in the house, as if he had seen enough of what steel does to men, and wanted none of it under his roof. He remembered the nights his father sat up in the dark kitchen with no light on, and how his mother would say, "Leave him be. He's just thinking," how Earl had believed for a long time that thinking and grieving were two different things. They were not. His father had been keeping a vigil his whole life over a grave. Nobody else knew was there. 11 acres of scrubland and one promise, and he had handed both of them to his son with a penny and 7 words, and trusted that someday the ground itself would explain the rest. It had been the last week of his father's life, in a hospice room that smelled of antiseptic and cut flowers. Tom Vance had been drifting in and out, morphine, pulling him under and letting him surface, and in one of those surfacings he had gripped Earl's wrist with a strength that did not belong to a dying man, and had said very clearly, "She never left. I couldn't get her up. She's still down there." Earl had thought it was the medicine talking, the way the dying talk to people who aren't in the room. He had said, "Easy, Dad, I'm here," and his father had shaken his head, frustrated, as if Earl were the one who could not understand plain English, and had pressed the penny into his palm. The penny he had carried for 50 years, and had said the last full sentence Earl would ever hear from him. If you ever find her, you bring her home. You hear me, you bring her home. Then he had closed his eyes, and 3 days later he was gone. Earl had buried his father, believing those words were nothing more than the fog of a leaving mind. He had been wrong for almost 30 years. He set the penny on the kitchen table, looked at it for a long time, and then he stood up because he finally understood that nobody was coming. The only man left who could keep his father's promise was him. What he did over the next 2 months, he did the way he had done everything in his life, without an audience and without complaint. He could not hire a crew. The museum had laughed him out the door, and his pension did not stretch to excavators. So he became the crew, borrowed and bartered for a battered farm tractor and a set of chain hoists. He dug by hand in the cool of the mornings and rigged in the heat of the afternoons, one bucket of clay. At a time he opened the earth around the hull, until the whole grave gaped raw and red against the green grass. He built timber cribbing the way the army had taught him, freeing the suspension bogies, knocking decades of packed soil sal out of the road, wheels with a length of pipe, and a 4-pound hammer until his shoulders burned. Turret had seized solid on its ring, rust welded by years underground, and he spent 11 straight days on that alone, soaking the race with penetrating oil and working it a hair at a time with a pry bar and patience, till the morning it broke free, with a groan like something waking up, and traversed. Earl Vance sat down in the dirt and laughed out loud at the empty sky. The work aged him, and it healed him in the same motion. He kept his father's old technical manuals on the kitchen table, the dog-eared TM books for a vehicle that had been obsolete before Earl was born, proud. And at night he read them under the lamp the way other men read the Bible, relearning a machine a generation older than the patterns he had spent his life inside. The Sherman was not the tank he knew. The suspension was different. The gun was different. The whole logic of the thing belonged to his father's war and not his own. So he came to it humble, as a student, which was the only honest way to come to it at all. He fabricated what he could not find, cut a track-tensioning tool out of scrap when the original had long since rusted to lace. He pulled each bogie wheel, cleaned the bearings, packed them by feel, and reset them one at a time, and when his hands cramped too badly to grip, he soaked them in hot water and Epsom salt at the sink and went back out. He worked through a week of rain under a tarp strung between the truck and a fence post, the water running brown off the hull and pooling in the pit, and he bailed it by the bucket and kept going. Neighbours slowed on the county road to look at the strange shape rising out of the old man's backyard, and a few stopped to ask, and Earl told them the plain truth, that he had found a tank, and watched them decide he was telling stories, and let them. He did not need them to believe him. He had stopped needing anyone to believe him a long time ago. He went into the fighting compartment, through the commander's hatch, and inside he found the war preserved like an insect in amber. He found the gunner's seat and the breech of the 75mm gun, the radio rack, the brass shell stowage, and on the whole floor he found things he did not photograph and did not speak of, small ruined evidence that men had lived, and not all of them had gotten out. He cleaned the bore with a hand-cut rod and rag soaked in solvent, inch by inch, until the rifling shone. He took apart the firing mechanism, the breech block, and the firing pin, and the extractor, parts he had not handled since his father showed him their like as a boy at the annex, and he laid every piece out on a clean tarp and rebuilt it the way you rebuild anything that matters. slowly and correctly, and with respect. He did not try to make her run. The engine had been a tomb for steel too long for that. But he made her whole. He made her a tank again instead of a grave. And on the 51st day, working the wire brush across the front plate to clear the last of the scale, he uncovered something painted there beneath the rust, and his hands went still, because the worst part of his father's silence had never been the things the old man would not say. The worst part was that Earl was about to learn what those things had cost. What came up under the wire brush was paint, faded to a ghost, but paint, the cocky hand lettering of young men who decorate the thing that might kill them. So it feels a little more like theirs. There was a name across the glasses in tired yellow letters, and beside it, painted careful and round, the unmistakable likeness of a coin. The name read Lucky Penny. Earl Vance stood in the bottom of that pit, with a wire brush in one hand, and his father's penny in the other, and for the first time in 30 years he wept, because he understood now that the disc in his pocket and the painting on the steel were the same, penny, and that the thing his father could not get up out of the ground was not a tank at all. It was the men who never climbed out of it. He scrubbed lower, hands shaking, and there beneath the name he cleared the registration plate stamped into the hull. USA 3214762, and he photographed it in the failing light, not knowing that the same 9 characters had been burning a hole in a young woman's conscience. 3 counties away for 51 days. Danny Okafor had not been able to let it go. The morning after the old man left, punned, she had pulled up the smeared photo in her memory and typed what she thought she'd seen into the museum's registry database, and then into the National Vehicle Records, and then into the old unit rosters the museum kept on a shelf nobody touched. USA 3014762, it came back the way some records do, with a flag on it, an annotation entered into the system years ago by a researcher who had asked to be notified if that exact number ever surfaced anywhere in the world. The tank was an M4 medium, the file said, assigned to the 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division, struck off the books as a combat loss on August the 8th, 1944, near the town of Mortagne in Normandy. Burned. Total loss. And the researcher who had filed the flag, who had spent the better part of 50 years looking for one tank out of the thousands America had lost, a retired Army colonel named Daniel Hollis, the most respected armour historian in 3 states, and, as it happened, the single largest private benefactor the Ironwood Museum had ever known. Danny sat very still in front of her screen. Then she printed the page, walked it back to the restoration bay, and laid it on the bench in front of Tyler Cates without a word. Tyler read it twice. He remembered the old man, the feed store cat, the bedtime story line, the laugh, and he felt the floor of his stomach drop out. Because he was young and cruel careless, but he was not a fool, and he could see exactly what he had done. He wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a wrong number, an old man who had read a plate off a photograph in a museum and mixed it up. He said as much. He said there was no possible way a tank lost in France was sitting under a garden in Maryland, that the records had to be crossed, that they should not bother the colonel over a crank with a shovel. And Danny Okafor, 23, and had been laughed at in her life by men who were sure of themselves, looked him dead in the eye, and said the thing that turned the whole story on its hinge. She said, "You didn't even look at the photo, Tyler. You just decided." And what if you're wrong? Tyler had no answer for that. He stood there with the printout in his hand, and somewhere underneath, the embarrassment. A much worse feeling was beginning, feeling of a man who realizes he may have spit on something sacred without ever bothering to learn its name. It was Danny who made the call. Colonel Daniel Hollis was 83 years old, sharp as a bayonet, and he had been a soldier and a scholar, and, before any of that, fatherless boy. His father, Corporal James Hollis, had been the gunner of a Sherman tank in the 33rd Armoured Regiment, and he had died in it on the 8th of August 1944, 3 months before his son was born. Daniel had grown up with a folded flag, Purple Heart, in a drawer, and exactly one photograph. A grinning young man in a tanker's jacket, leaning against the front plate of his Sherman, the words penny painted beside his head, holding up a penny to the camera. Between two fingers, like a magician showing a coin. For 50 years Daniel Hollis had tried to find that tank, because the official record said the crew remains had never been recovered from the wreck, and a man who never knew his father will move heaven and earth for a place to stand and say, "Here, this is where you were." He had built a career and a reputation on armour history, in no small part as an excuse to keep looking. He had written to the army, and to the French government, and to half the museums in Europe. He had walked the fields outside Mortain 3 separate times across the decades, an old American in a rented car asking farmers if anyone remembered where the burned tanks had been pushed off the roads in 1944, and every trail had gone cold, because the record said she had been a total loss, and total losses do not get followed. They get tallied. He had long ago made his peace with the idea that he would die without ever finding the place, that his father would remain a photograph and a folded flag, and a penny held up to a camera, poured. He had flagged the registration number in every database. He could reach more out of stubbornness than hope. When Danny Okafor's voice came down the line and read those 9 characters aloud, the colonel did not speak for a long moment. Then he asked her, very quietly, to say the name painted on the hull one more time, and when she said Lucky Penny, the old soldier set down the phone and put his hand over his mouth, and 3 counties away an old tanker he had never met was washing the dirt of 50 years off his father's tank. The morning the museum came, Earl Vance had her sitting in his driveway, walked the freed hull up out of the pit on timber and steel plate, inch by inch with the tractor and the hoists over 4 exhausting days, and he had parked her on the gravel facing the road, hatches open, gun levelled, the faded name catching the early light. He had called the museum the night before and told the young man who answered to come and see what was parked in his driveway, and he had hung up before they could laugh again. 3 vehicles came up his long dirt lane that morning, a museum van, a pickup, and last, plain dark sedan that pulled to the side and stopped and stayed stopped, its door not opening. Tyler Cates got out of the van first, and he had come ready, with his apology half rehearsed and his disbelief still half intact. And then he saw her. He saw a complete, correct, lovingly resurrected M4 Sherman standing in an old man's driveway where a vegetable garden was supposed to be, and every word he had prepared died in his throat. Marcus, beside him, took off his cap without seeming to know he had done it. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a single thing. The only sound on that whole property was the tick of cooling engines, and the wind in the tree line, and an old man in a clean shirt standing beside the machine, with his hands folded in front of him, waiting, patient as he had been his entire life. For a long moment, the museum men simply stood at the edge of the gravel, and could not make themselves come closer. The way you slow down without meaning, to when you pass something that demands more of you than you came prepared to give. They had restored vehicles their whole careers, brought rust back to running order, knew to the bolt what it took to make a thing like this stand again. And that was precisely why the sight undid them, because they understood better than anyone alive what one man with hand tools and 60 days had actually done, and the knowing was its own kind of shame. Tyler's mouth had gone dry. He thought of the photograph he had not looked at, the number he had not read, the word he had used, junk, and he wished with everything in him that he could take that morning back and walk it again as a better man. It was Danny who finally walked forward, and she had brought the file, and she laid it open on the Sherman's front fender beside the stenciled number, and she read it out loud so they would all have to hear it. USA 34762, 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division. Combat loss, the 8th of August, 1944, Mortain, France. Recovered as a battle-damaged study hull, shipped to the Hartwell Ordnance Annex for survivability testing in 1946, stricken from inventory and disposed of on site when the annex was closed and buried in 1958. The records had never been reconciled. To the Army's books, this tank had burned to nothing on a French hillside 82 years ago. And yet here she stood, whole in the morning sun, on the very ground they had bulldozed her under, restored by the son of the man whose family had bought that ground precisely, so that he could be near her, though none of them knew that part yet. Tyler Cates looked at the old man he had called confused, and he understood that he was standing in the presence of something he did not have the vocabulary to name. The shame of the museum that morning was a living thing. That was when the door of the dark sedan finally opened. Colonel Daniel Hollis crossed the gravel slowly. Leaning on a cane he plainly hated, his eyes fixed on the painted name, as if it were the only object in the world. He did not look at the staff. He did not look at the gun or the tracks or the immaculate hull. He walked the length of his father's tank with one hand trailing along the steel. He stopped at the front plate. And he stopped the front plate, and he stood before the faded yellow letters that he had memorized from a single photograph 70 years before, and the old colonel, who had commanded men in 2 wars, and buried more friends than he could count, put his forehead against the cold steel of the machine his father had died in and wept, without any shame at all. Earl Vance watched him, and something turned over in his chest. A recognition deeper than the one he had felt the first day in the mud, and he reached into his pocket and took out the penny. And he held it out flat on his enormous scarred palm. He said the first words he had spoken since they arrived. He said, "I think this belongs with you." The colonel turned. He looked at the worn brown disc on the old mechanic's hand, and then he reached into his own coat and brought out a copy of the only photograph he owned of his father. The grinning gunner, holding up a coin beside the painted name. And he held the photograph beside the penny so they all could see. The match was past any doubt. Daniel Hollis asked, in a voice gone to gravel, where Earl had gotten it, and Earl told him. What Earl told him he had pieced together over 30 years, from a handful of words his father let slip, and the rest he had read in the unit's after-action files once he finally went looking. On the morning of the 8th of August, 1944, the 33rd Armoured Regiment had been ordered to plug a gap on the high ground, east of Mortain, where the German counterattack had hit the American line like a hammer. The roads were sunken lanes, walled in by Normandy hedgerow, blind corners every 50 yards, the worst country in the world for a tank, because you could not see the gun that was about to kill you until it had already fired. Tom Vance was a sergeant then, 24 years old, and Lucky Penny was his tank, and James Hollis was his gunner, kid from Ohio with a wife and a baby coming, and habit of wedging a 1923 penny against the rim of the gun sight before every fight, because, he said, a man ought to have something on him that was older than the war. They went up that lane at first light into a fog that smelled of cordite and cut hay. The German anti-tank gun was dug in at the crook of the road where the hedge turned, and it fired once. The round came through the front plate low and to the right, into the gunner's station, and James Hollis never knew it happened, which was the only mercy in any of it. The tank brewed up. Tom Vance and the two crewmen who could still move bailed out through the hatches into machine gun fire, and then Tom did the thing he never spoke of, the thing that cost him every quiet night for the rest of his life. He went back. He climbed back up onto the burning hull and dropped into the smoke and pulled his gunner out by the straps of his harness. Boy was already gone. Because he could not stand to leave him to the fire, as he laid him in the ditch, he saw the penny still wedged where it always rode, and he took it because it was the only piece of James Hollis small enough to carry and too important to leave. He told Earl about Master Sergeant Thomas Vance, who had commanded that tank up that road and gone back into the flames when she was hit, carried the lucky penny for 50 years afterward. But, like a debt that could never be paid, who had taken the civilian mechanic's job at the annex and recognised his own tank in the disposal yard and stood there, unable to save her a second. Time, who had bought the 11 acres beside her grave so that he could keep a kind of watch over her, who at the very end had pressed the penny into his son's hand and said, "If you ever find her, bring her home." 2 old men stood beside a resurrected Sherman in a Maryland driveway, the son of the commander who had lived and the son of the gunner who had died. Between them on a scarred palm sat the small bright reason both of their fathers had never truly come all the way home. After that, nobody quite knew what to say, and so, for a while, nobody said anything, which was the most honest thing they could have done. Tyler Cates was the one who finally moved. He walked up to Earl Vance, and the speech he had rehearsed was gone. Came out instead was just the truth, plainly. He said, "I laughed at you. I never even looked. I'm sorry, sir. I don't have a better word than that." And Earl Vance, who had been disrespected by experts his whole life, and had never once let it turn him hard, looked at the young man for a moment, and then put one of those huge grease-stained hands on his shoulder and said only, "You looked now." That was all. No lecture, no triumph, no rubbing it in. Just a door left open for a young man to walk through and become better than he had been, which is the only kind of victory that was ever worth anything to a man like Earl. Marcus, beside them, was already on the phone to the museum director. Danny stood by the front plate with her hand resting on the painted penny. She was crying and did not care who saw. And the colonel, the most decorated and respected man any of them would ever meet, walked back to the side of the tank and slowly, with great effort, came to attention and raised his hand in a salute he held for a long, long time, not to any of the living, but to the steel and to the man inside the memory of it. The story did not end in that driveway, though it could have, and it would have been enough. The Ironwood Museum did not take the tank. The director, when he understood what he was looking at, would not hear of it. Instead, the museum did the harder and better thing. They helped Earl Vance and Daniel Hollis petition the army, and after a year of paperwork and the patient excavation of the rest of that pit by a real crew with real machines, the remains that Earl had found on the hull floor, and not spoken of, were finally recovered, identified, and laid to rest with full military honours in a national cemetery, 82 years late, under a stone that finally bore the gunner's name. Corporal James Hollis came home. His son stood at the graveside in his old dress uniform, and was, at 83, no longer a fatherless boy. The Sherman herself was restored properly with the museum's help, and given a place of honour, not behind glass, but out in the open, where children could touch her tracks, with a plaque that told the whole truth, combat loss, and the burial and the old mechanic who would not be laughed off his own land. They left the faded name exactly as Earl had uncovered it. They did not repaint Lucky Penny. things you preserve precisely as the years have left them. Because the where is the point. Reconciliation of the records took longer than the digging had. There were forms for everything, affidavits and chains of custody, and a determination by a board of officers who had never held a wrench in their lives, and more than once Earl wanted to tell the whole apparatus where it could go. But Daniel Hollis had spent a career learning how to move a stubborn institution 1 inch at a time. Earl had spent a lifetime learning patience in the bottom of grease pits. Between the two of them, they wore the army down the way water wears down stone. The day the determination finally came through, day the books were corrected, and USA 3014 to 762 was struck from the rolls of the destroyed and entered into the rolls of the recovered. Clerk somewhere typed a single line into a database and never knew that he had closed a wound 82 years wide. At the cemetery the bugler played, and the rifles cracked 3 times into a clear blue morning, and they folded a new flag and put it into the hands of an 83-year-old man who had been waiting for it his entire life. Earl Vance stood at the back, out of the way. Because he did not think the day belonged to him, Daniel Hollis found him afterward, and would not let him leave until he had taken him by both shoulders and said, "That boy in the ground has his name back because of you, and there is no medal in the United States Army worth more than that." And Earl, who had never in his life known what to do with praise, just nodded and looked at the grass and held on to the Colonel's arm a little longer than he meant to. Tyler Cates changed, the way the witnessing of something true can change a person who is young enough to still be made. He asked Earl if he could come out to the property on weekends, and Earl, who had been alone with his machines for a long time, said yes. The old tanker taught the young restorer everything, the feel of a seized bearing, and the patience of penetrating oil, and the difference between fixing a thing and honouring it. And Tyler began to treat the people who walked through the museum's door with the careful attention of a man who had learned the hard way what it costs to decide you already know. He never again laughed at anyone who said they had found something. He looked, and on the day they dedicated the tank in its new place of honour was Tyler, who insisted that Earl Vance be the one to pull the cover. And Earl Vance, 79 by then, stood beside the Colonel and the young man he had forgiven. And the old penny rode in the Colonel's breast pocket now, exactly where it belonged, finally and completely home. There is a particular kind of man the world is built to overlook, and Earl Vance was one of them. Quiet old soul in muddy boots with grease he could never wash out, and a story nobody bothered to ask for. The world looked at him and saw nothing worth its time. And the world was wrong, the way it is so often wrong about the people who carry the heaviest things without ever asking to be seen carrying them. He never wanted thanks. He only wanted to keep a promise his father had made him, and in keeping it, he brought 2 families and 1 lost crew the peace that 80 years and an entire army had failed to deliver. There is a particular arithmetic the world prefers, an accounting that measures a man by his uniform and his bank account, and the confidence in his voice. By that arithmetic, Earl Vance was a rounding error, an overlooked quantity, a forgettable old face in a feed store cap. But there is another, accounting underneath it, slower and truer and indifferent to appearances, the one that measures a man by what he is willing to do alone. Unwitnessed, for no reward, simply because it is right, and because he gave his word. By that reckoning, Earl Vance was one of the wealthiest men any of them had ever stood beside. And the museum men who had laughed understood it now, would carry the understanding the rest of their lives. The last time anyone saw Earl out at the tank, he was standing alone, in the early light with one scarred hand flat against the front plate beside the faded name. Not saying anything, the way he never said anything, just keeping his watch over the steel and the men and the long-kept promise that had finally, the very end of everything, come home. If this old man earned your respect today, leave it in one word below: subscribe. So the next forgotten hero who deserves to be remembered doesn't get buried twice, because some people spend their whole lives being underestimated. The least we can do is finally look.